Thank you. Like Sarah, I'm also not a lawyer. So I'd also like to thank you for including me in this discussion. I'm currently working in the regional office of the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, based in Jordan, and we're covering the 18 countries of the Middle East region. So I'm going to try and look at this more from a development perspective in the context of the challenges and opportunities for women in the Arab region in post-conflict situations and the potential for international law to support them. Of course, the reality is that there's a number of ongoing conflicts that are violating international law on a daily basis, so it's quite difficult to talk about post-conflict situations. Nevertheless, UNDP has big stabilization programs in Iraq and in Libya, and has other programs in Syria and Yemen where we're trying to move beyond humanitarian assistance and to give people the possibilities of rebuilding their communities with some focus on women's empowerment. So, as I said, I'll try and look at that through some of the prism of international laws and conventions. But as I said, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm slightly wary of defining what law might be, so I'm going to dare to do it nevertheless. So I'm going to suggest that in this context, what we consider to be law would cover international agreements such as the Convention to End the Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, UN Security Council resolutions, and perhaps even the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I accept entirely that the Sustainable Development Goals have no legal standing, and there's no retribution for governments who miss the targets, just as there is no punishment for governments that fail to implement the recommendations of CEDAW. But the Sustainable Development Goals have been accepted by all governments, so they offer a useful tool to advocate for change. And a recent legal ruling in Spain suggested that CEDAW recommendations should be considered obligatory. So I think we should start from there, and we should start with the positive. Post-conflict situations offer a potential opportunity for change, to build on the changes that have been brought about by economic necessity. For example, women who have had to learn new skills, who have become heads of households, family earners, decision makers in times of conflict and displacement. Those are situations that have been brought about by tragedy, but nevertheless, they brought about a changed social dynamic. And also, there's an opportunity in the potential to introduce change in post-conflict societies to start more inclusive local decision-making in the context of rebuilding communities. Unfortunately, though, evidence suggests that these opportunities are often missed. And the first hurdle is often the nature of a peace agreement itself, or even a temporary ceasefire. The bunch of Security Council resolutions, starting with 1325 in 2000, which has set out clear parameters for including women in peace agreements and in security structures, recognized that problem, and there have been some changes in the region in attitudes involving women in peace and security. There are more women in the police, for example, in Iraq and Jordan, more women in parliaments across the region. But if we look at the ongoing conflicts, despite the commitments of the UN Secretary General and the attempts by UN Women to introduce women to the peace table, we've seen very little evidence of practical impact. UN Women have helped create a women's advisory board for Syria and have a similar initiative for Yemen. And the UN Special Mission in Libya has worked hard to bring Libyan women together as an alternative political force. But in all cases, women continue to be sidelined in peace negotiations, with few, if any, of them at the table. And some of you may or may not have noticed in the recent talks on Libya, the Italians simply forgot to invite any Libyan women. Luckily, the Canadians, who have a feminist foreign policy, changed the dynamic and invited Libyan women there. But the reality was that the hosts forgot to include women. So the problem with that is that any agreements that are reached could completely ignore key issues that affect half the population. So you could have, it means that any clauses on reparations, which we might hear a bit more about, won't include women victims, that sexual violence in conflict will go unpunished, that disarmament programs will focus on men, and that any immediate cash for work programs or infrastructure investments will also focus on men, assuming that they are the heads of households. And unfortunately, we can see some of these problems already happening in Iraq. To illustrate what I mean, I'd like to take the example of displaced women heads of households in Iraq or Syria seeking to return home and reclaiming the houses or land in which they lived with their husbands and families before the conflict. There are many related difficulties. Firstly, the names of women in the Arab world rarely appear on the title deeds of property. This is possibly by convention rather than legal necessity, and some changes are beginning to be introduced in some countries. Nevertheless, generally, women are unlikely to have their names on property, which means that if you're going to return, you're going to have a big problem reclaiming your property. Next problem is that women who have been married or widowed in situations of displacement probably don't have a legally recognized marriage or death certificate. And children who are born in those situations possibly don't have recognizable birth certificates. In countries where nationality can only be passed by fathers, that's very serious. Children born to Syrian women in Lebanon, for example, are in danger of being stateless. And then there are issues of inheritance. Wives do have rights to inherit some of their husband's property in most Arab countries, even if the rights are limited, but often they are pressurized by family members to give up those rights. So let's put ourselves in the position of a widowed Syrian woman with 3 kids trying to return home to Aleppo. She's not got a marriage certificate and she's not got her name on any property deeds. She's going to need some help, right? Can international law help? Like I said, there's an opportunity in post-conflict situations to do things differently. And one option is to ensure that local municipalities and ministries of planning, helping people return in places like Mosul and Aleppo, are fully aware of international obligations and how they can be used to encourage more egalitarian decision-making. Most countries in the Arab region have signed and ratified CEDAW, even if they have reservations. And if we look at CEDAW, which is why these 2 articles are up here, they're relevant in that states parties shall accord women equality, shall accord women equality in property rights, and shall accord women the same rights for both spouses in respect of ownership, etc. So, even where a widow does not have her name on the deeds and may not have a marriage certificate, she's going to have some evidence of her marriage. It might only be photographs. She's going to have some evidence of her association with a house. Again, it may be photographs, or it may be her neighbors who can testify that actually, yes, she did live there with her kids before the conflict. An enlightened official can take this into account and can be encouraged to do so through the use of international law. And 2 other things that might be useful. Some of you may have heard of the Pinheiro Principles. They were agreed in 2005. They cover the rights to land and property of returning refugees and displaced persons. They offer a clear framework and guidance for those involved in helping returnee populations and set out the importance of consultation and discussion both with the displaced people, but also with those who have stayed behind and may have moved into someone else's property. My point is that these guidelines are useful international tools that can help women in post-conflict situations. And then there are the Sustainable Development Goals. And there you are. Okay, the very first, we won't go into all 17, don't worry. The very first, to end poverty. And I repeat, all governments have signed up for these, right? So indicator 142, I've tried to highlight it, includes that governments are supposed to be measuring the proportion of total adult population who perceive their rights to land as secure by sex and by type of tenure. Okay, even having such an indicator agreed to by all governments doesn't necessarily mean that there will be immediate change. And to help measure, but they are tools to advocate for that change, and they are a means to measure whether that change is happening. A government like Iraq, which is managing millions potentially of returns, can be encouraged to ensure that this indicator, which they are obliged to report on, applies to all sections of the population, including returnees and those living in former areas of conflict. I've concentrated on property rights because it's a tangible example of the kind of changes that are needed in post-conflict situations to encourage gender equality. But as I said in the beginning, there's another type of opportunity available, an opportunity to change the nature of decision-making, to take the chance of the attempts to rebuild communities and societies to make them more inclusive, to use cash for work programs to include women as well as men, for example. And there is good activity trying to do that in Mosul right now, however difficult. To rebuild community centers so that they have spaces for women to meet, but that they also have spaces for men and women to meet together so that they can discuss local issues and make decisions together about them. Post-conflict situations offer opportunities to change gender dynamics, but these opportunities are not always taken. A better use of international law might offer one way to advocate for change. Thank you.